Well, thank you all for coming. We really appreciate the turnout to have this glorious sunny night. I wanted to start with a show of hands. Some of you have already read the book because this will help us, okay? So we've got a handful. So I think what we'll do is start with sort of a summary of what the narrative is about, and then we're gonna sort of weave through a conversation around Fitzgerald, around what our exhibit talks about, what the book talks about, and then, get into the politics of life.
Yeah, and I won't give any spoilers. Thank you, first of all. This is such an amazing turnout. I really appreciate you all being here. It means so much, and thank you, Carol. I'm honored to be here. So a little bit about the book. Sweet Fury is a literary thriller. It was published in January by Simon & Schuster, and is subsequently being published in over 100 countries around the world over the course of this year. And it is about Viola Crane is the main character, and she is a famous film actress who's adored the world over. And at the start of the book, she and her famous film director boyfriend named Kurt Royal moved from LA to New York because they're about to begin pre-production on their next film, which is an adaptation of Fitzgerald's final completed novel, Tender as the Night, which they're shooting out in the Hamptons. She's playing the lead role of the film, Nicole Diver, and to prepare for this role, she begins therapy with an esteemed therapist in the West Village. His name is Jonah Gabriel, to dig into the trauma of her past. But as she does so, her life begins to unravel, and the characters in the book all become entangled in this deadly game of revenge.
Excellent. So, can you give a brief summary of what Tender is the Night is about? Because the interweaving is fascinating, and then we can expand into the larger work of Fitzgerald and how that helps us.
Summarizing Tender as the Night is kind of difficult because it's a bit unwieldy of a book, but what I will say is that how people have read Tender as the Night. Oh, good. Wow, this is impressive. Okay. So, there is I mentioned this to somebody before we began, but there is a hot debate among Fitzgerald fans as to whether Fitzgerald's masterpiece is Gatsby or Tender, do you know that, are you in the camp?
Yeah, not Tender.
Okay, yeah. I mean, my opinion is that Tender is a more ambitious book than Gatsby, but I think that Gatsby is a more successful novel. But so Tender is the Night is really wild, unwieldy, and it is kind of a mess, and it is so, I think, in large part because it is so heavily autobiographical. It deals in large part with sort of the rise and fall and demise of his forward relationship with Zelda, heavily fictionalized with Dr. Diver and Nicole. Dick Diver and Nicole Diver are the two main characters. And it's basically, so Dick Diver is an esteemed doctor, and his patient is this young, winsome woman named Nicole. They fall in love. Despite what he maybe should do as a doctor, they decide to get married, and it sort of goes back and forth in time and chronicles the rise and fall of their marriage. He has multiple affairs. He falls in love with a young actress named Rosemary. Nicole has a very difficult past, a lot of mental illness. She's a schizophrenic. And basically, the couple, they live in the French Riviera for a long time, and they have wild, lavish parties, and he descends into alcoholism. She eventually gets to separate herself from him, and at the end of the book, spoiler alert for Tender as the Night, Dick Diver sort of fades into obscurity. And it's kind of incredible in that it is in some ways prophetic of Fitzgerald's life and sort of his career, because when he died, despite the fact that he's so well known and famous now, both Gatsby and Tender as the Night, when they were published, did not do well. It was only posthumously that he became the legend that he is. And so when he died, he was an alcoholic, his heart failed him, and he died believing that he was a failure.
Very good summary. Well, and some of the things about that narrative and really looking at that construction of that life, I think weave nicely into the story that you tell. There's this whole notion of sort of who we are, who we present ourselves as, right? This idea of sort of the mass presence, and that take place, I mean, for 100 years now, this has been a narrative, and it's interesting that it's so sort of prevalent within Fitzgerald's life, within Tender as the Night, it's true within Gatsby, and it's true within your novel. Walk me through the process, because in order to construct that in a book, do you have post-it notes on your bathroom wall? Like, how are you doing this to keep track of what we know at what point?
It's a really good question. I mean, so Fitzgerald, which maybe I'll get into a little later, but that was sort of secondary for me. That was not one of the initial ideas of this book. But one of the reasons why I decided to write this book and write a thriller, because my taste as a reader is it's straight literary fiction. I don't really read thrillers. And so a lot of people who read this book, it is a thriller, but people who don't typically go for thrillers really like it. I don't think it's a typical thriller in that way because of my own taste. But I wrote, I decided to write a thriller because I felt that my weakness as a writer at the time was in plot and structure. And so thrillers, they live and die by plot and structure. If you don't have a tight plot for a thriller, it doesn't work as a book. And so this was my attempt to sort of better myself as a writer and sort of fix myself. So, in doing that, to answer your question, before I began writing, I spent weeks at least creating as bulletproof of an outline as possible before I set pen to paper. Obviously it wasn't bulletproof, but it was a tight plot that really helped me. But and talking about the themes that you're just bringing up, there is this huge theme of identity in the book. So with all of the characters in the book, with the exception of one character, nobody is who they seem to be. And I think that this is true of life, is that we all, as human beings, wear different masks depending on the given situation that we're in and who we're interacting with. And so in thinking about that theme, there's even a literal mask in the book. But in constructing sort of a pressure cooker environment for a thriller dealing with that theme, I knew that I wanted this book to be, an insider's look at the film industry and sort of as a way into my critique of American culture. And so having the two primary players, I chose an actress who was really a great actress, somebody who is both excellent at putting on masks for her work, but also who has to put on masks because of the trauma that she's endured in her life. And then thinking about, okay, if I'm creating this pressure cooker environment, who better to be her ally or her opponent, depending on the situation, than a therapist whose job is to get people to take off those masks.
And one of the things I love about what you deal with within the plot line is also this notion of feminism, like ownership of my action, how you create agency within the female characters, both within the translation of Tender as the Night. Because one of the big issues with this sort of ending of Tender as the Night is there really isn't a sort of comeuppance for Dick Diver for all the terrible things that he's done. It's like, he's gonna forget he existed. And so in the novel, there's a lot of discussion around what makes her a satisfying ending, what makes her a valuable female role within that. And so that was a really interesting spin on that. And when you were sort of investing in that Tender as the Night narrative within the novel, is that when that came to fore, or did you always want to talk about this idea of agency?
I always wanted to talk about the idea of agency, and so to give a little bit of history as to how Fitzgerald came into the book. As I mentioned, they're making this film in the book, and in the first draft, it was a film that was a made-up film written by Sash, and it was horrible, and I knew it was horrible, but I didn't know what it should be instead. And my incredible writers group, without whom I would not be a writer, this book would not be published. They're amazing. But one of the novelists said, this book, the themes and the characters are really reminding me of Tender as the Night. What if they were making an adaptation of Tender? And I never read Tender as the Night before. I only read The Great Gatsby, and so I read Tender as the Night, and then I went down this rabbit hole because it suggested it was obviously genius to make an adaptation, and sort of dug into Fitzgerald and really learned, soaked in as much as I could about Fitzgerald. But it was this amazing sort of stroke of luck that there was so much crossover. And of course, I leaned further into it, the deeper I dug about Tender, and of course, as I mentioned, how autobiographical it was, and sort of the very complex relationship between Scott and Zelda that informed that. But Tender as a Night is, it is a very heavily biased angle towards the male point of view. And the traditional read of that book is that Dick is the hero and sort of this martyr character, and that Nicole, his wife, is kind of vampiric. That she sort of leeches onto him and he cures her, and he sort of gives all of himself to her over the course of his life so that he eventually has absolutely nothing left. And so she is able to sort of strengthen herself like a leech and then leave him, and he's this poor broken man. But if you look at all of the puzzle pieces are there of looking at the trauma that Nicole has endured, and then you sort of extrapolate and you look at Zelda's very complex life and that entire story, it's very obvious that it is not black and white at all.
Right, and that's, that idea of sort of the male seeing himself in the hero role.
Mhm.
It is, I think, one of the things that, when we worked on the exhibit, Fitzgerald had a really hard time looking at his own failings. He had a really hard time acknowledging anything that was his own responsibility in his behavior. A lot of his, interactions with around being what he saw as turned down by Ginevra were driven by what he felt were not having family money. Yeah, being a drunk, failing out of Princeton, and not actually behaving well in public had nothing to do with it. Entirely all done, it does not have enough point. And so looking at the characters and then looking at the way you're able to pull that out, there's a Japanese notion in storytelling that no one is all good and not all evil. And you play really well into that part of the narrative, where you see parts of everyone's life through their own vision, which I think also helps keep us sort of in the dark as to how they're affecting the other people, because they only see it through their own space. In writing that, like that, being able to sort of put on that framework, did you have to sort of identify within each character what their positive traits were? Did you have to, like an actor does, right? Which is, I have to see them as a positive character or I can't play them.
Yeah, and I think the early drafts, they were just because I think that I wasn't smart enough to be able to just sort of like write the finished product. Like it was much more black and white, so that I could figure out what story I was trying to tell. And then it was about like adding the gradations, right? Adding the texture. But, to sort of in exploring that idea, structure became really important to me in this book. So the book is in many ways an epistolary novel. There are all of these different forms. You have the traditional, third person throughout this, sprinkled throughout the book, but the book is divided into three parts. And in the first part, there are these therapy session notes from the therapist's point of view, noting his sessions with PLAYA. In part two, there are Lila's journal entries to her therapist. There's the film and the book, and this was very intentional on my part. What I wanted to do is, I'm fascinated by, first I should say, one thing that was really important to me was to avoid telling a story that felt like I really wanted this to all live in the gray area, because that felt much more honest to me of what life is really like. The question of doubt, the question of, we as human beings are limited by our own subjective experience. And so because of that, is it actually ever possible for any of us to know the truth of what really happened, or will there always be doubt? And so in creating that structure, my idea was never to sort of spoon feed the audience the objective truth, but instead I'm sort of trying to force you into a more active detective role, and I'm giving you all of these angles at a given truth from these various perspectives, and it's up to you to put puzzle pieces together and determine your own truth.
And so one of the things about the structure, you call it a thriller, and I didn't really read it as a thriller. It's much more sort of Hitchcockian in that it's the psychological thriller. And you're really pulling apart sort of the psyche of folks and looking at their interactions and trying to figure out, Are they being manipulative? What is honest? What is dishonest? What's their intention? That part of it was great, like just so fascinating to really sort of piece through all of that. But I know that we've talked in the before about language, the actual art of language is really important. It's one of the things you really like about Fitzgerald. I know you did the reading of the prologue this afternoon. I would like you to read that for the audience, and then we can talk about the construction of language and the way Fitzgerald writes and what your goals are.
I'll just read the prologue, it was nice and short. She stands there in the aftermath, trapped behind a wall of glass in a silent, seismic horror. Outside, dawn is just beginning its pearl, the sky over the Hudson a blooming bruise, skin of the water slate to silver, fingers of fog curling in. The world a milky calm, still unmarred by the carnage within. But she knows nothing will ever be the same again. Her stunned gaze travels down to her dress, stippled darkly with red. Her innocent hands somehow sticky with blood. So much blood everywhere, so terribly bright. Her stomach swells. She can't think of it. She takes in the surviving remnants of the devastated room. The black book, the apocalyptic painting, the gold mask with unseeing eyes, the knife. Beyond the glass, the clouds shift and the blade flashes, blinding. She won't look at the slump of flesh on the floor, puddles still spreading, the sick within her rising. No, she must put a stop to it once and for all. He's turned towards the balcony, backlit against the horizon's slow swell, one foot lunging before the other in a runner's stance, as though it might be any other morning, as though he might simply go for a jog, return with a coffee, steaming in the early chill. In the distance, one by one, the green lights of the shore beyond begin to blink out. She must act quickly. Time is running out and she's still in mortal danger. She presses her palms to her ears, forces her focus to the sound of that soothing inner swirl, draws within herself, a plucked chord singing to stillness. Breathes. She opens her eyes, unlocks her phone, and then she places the call. "It's okay," she whispers, and the tears begin to stream. "Someone's been stabbed, he's... Oh God, I think he's dead."
So just in that section, there's so much of that language, the green lights blinking out, the description of the water and the waves, the way she talks about the breaking of the light and the sky. It's so Fitzgeraldian. And I know that that's intentional, but it is really beautiful, and you don't see that a lot anymore in writing. I feel like it's a miracle you got a contract, because that's not really what anybody's buying anymore, but it is lovely. And so in working that language in, how much did you go back to Fitzgerald to sort of create these Easter eggs of language that are scattered throughout?
I mean, this is also just Sash Bischoff taste in terms of like my happiest time as a writer is creating lyrical prose, like trying to get an image exactly right. So thank you, that just means so much to me. And it's one of the reasons why I love Fitzgerald's writing so much, is because I think of him as one of the masters of creating these exquisite images that they are just singular. And that, I mean, at times it's so beautiful that it brings tears to my eyes reading it. It just feels so perfect, so right. And so that's what I'm always striving to do. And so it was fun to further lean into that, with my own writing with this and sort of weaving in Fitzgerald. Because Fitzgerald came in secondarily to, this already formulated plot, I was lucky in that when I was reading all of his works and really getting intimately acquainted with his works, I was reading with my own plot in the back of my head. So I was reading and thinking, ooh, this could be really good, as an Easter egg. So there was some of that. I will say that there's one chapter that happens near the end of the book that takes place at Princeton, and I can't say too much about it because it's a big spoiler, but that chapter in particular was one where I was really trying to be Fitzgeraldian in the way in which I depicted Princeton in that world. And what I do is quite deliberate in that I am plucking relatively sizable chunks of Fitzgerald's own prose and putting it in there from The Side of Paradise, from Beautiful and Damned, and from The Great Gatsby. And in each of those sections, which are beautiful sections of writing, they are told from the male point of view in Fitzgerald's works. And I am taking each of them and deliberately turning them on their head and asking the question of, well, it is beautiful and romantic when told from the male's point of view, but what if this were told from the other side? What if this were the woman's point of view?
So it's interesting, you went to Princeton, did you go back and look at any of his work at the Princeton Library? And when you were reading for the first time, The Side of Paradise, which is his college narrative, right? And how much of it struck you as being resonant for your experience with Princeton? Like, how much of that is sort of eternal in the way the Princeton experience plays out? And how much of it is just dated for the era in which he is there?
I mean, the things that are dated about it, and most sort of glaringly, are the things that really bother me about his works in general. You know, it's like the sexism, the racism, the homophobia, like all of the anti-Semitism. So those are the things that really stick out to me as being very dated. But I think in terms of his depiction of his time at Princeton, it's familiar in that it's like the romantic ideal of what we would love Princeton to be. And that is the section that I was just referring to of my Princeton section in my book. I was deliberately doing that as well, trying to create sort of the most romanticized, idealized version of Princeton, the way that Fitzgerald did in his own work. And that was my intention with setting throughout this book. You know, the book takes place there for a little bit, and it takes place in New York City in the West Village, and it takes place in Montauk in the Hamptons. And you know, the Hamptons are a great example of this. Is that for me, the Hamptons, there's the obvious connection to Gatsby, right? Gatsby's location is so close to the Hamptons, but I think of the Hamptons as so Fitzgeraldian in the sort of romantic beauty of the place, the ostentatious wealth, the glamorized lifestyle, the hedonism. And so my intention with each of these places, which are really beautiful places, really expensive places, and really exclusive enclaves in America, is to portray them the way that Fitzgerald might have, of romanticizing them, of idealizing them, to then, for my own purposes, of peeling back the skin of those places and revealing this uglier, grittier underbelly of our country and our culture that sort of persists in this obsession with fame and wealth.
And I love that component of it. You know, one of the things that I think really reminded me a lot of Gatsby is if you were going to try to write a Gatsby-esque novel today and sort of talk about this notion of sort of the admired wealthy, it is Hollywood, it is celebrity, it is this notion. So the fact that you set it in film and you create this main character who is globally known and has this incredible image that she has to protect, so much of it reminded me of sort of the construction of Gatsby and the way that you create this world that you see into from the outside, and then seeing it from the inside and seeing all the seams and the underbelly of it is fascinating. Why 100 years later are we still fascinated?
I know this. I mean, this is part of my point, though, is asking that question. It's why in America is to be successful is to be rich. You know, nothing has changed from Gatsby to now. And you know, this is one of the things that I am leaning into and criticizing.
Yeah. And again, really well done. And it pulls out these really evocative sort of parallels between the two worlds, the one that he creates. And again, one of the things we tackle with the exhibit is that a lot of what he does is mythologize sort of the superficial, shallow socialite. That's not really who he encounters, but it's a really good armor for him to say why he got turned down. Because again, if all she sees is whether or not he has money, he doesn't have to look at his own flaws. When you look at Hollywood today, when you look at this idea of celebrity and you look at sort of the group that sort of clings to the narrative of who they think somebody is, Fitzgerald himself is guilty of this.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I mean, this is one of the, when we discussed it a little bit, and I really love to hear more of your thoughts, but, we both take issue with things about Fitzgerald, but, Fitzgerald's has been considered, is still considered the great American writer, Gatsby, the great American novel. And, one of the reasons why this continues, I think, and why it is still considered the great American novel is because he was able to help, through that novel, help America sort of define itself through the way in which he reframed the American dream. That it was sort of the disillusionment and the corruption of the American dream and the sort of dichotomy that he's able to hold so beautifully in The Great Gatsby between that need for the hope, and yet at the same time how corrupt it can be and how hopeless, and sort of the way in which he depicts this tragedy and sort of the myth of the self-made man. And it's so interesting because when you look at his own life, he is clearly in a war with himself because he sees this in this beautiful, brilliant way. He writes about it, and yet he is completely susceptible to it
He
himself.
wants it. He desperately wants it.
Yeah. I read something that you wrote in an interview that I thought was so fascinating about how, and I'd never heard it this way, about how if he had gone the sort of direction of Ginevra, that he would have become more Nick's path. But because of the path that he took, he ended up being more like Gatsby. And I love that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been an interesting thing to sort of look at the framing. So for those of you who, only read Gatsby in high school and do not remember much of it, there are three main male characters. You've got Nick Carraway, who's the sort of secondary narrator. He sits from the outside, he looks in, and he is this, he's a friend of Gatsby, but he's objective about it. He's Daisy's cousin. Then you've got the man that Daisy is married to, is Tom Buchanan, who is literally from Lake Forest, and he has wealth, and he is shallow, and he is harsh, and he is a cheater, and just a belligerent human being. And then you've got Gatsby, who is desperately, deeply in love with the fantasy of a woman that he met when he was a teenager. And when you look at Fitzgerald, he plays all those roles as well. And it's interesting because the Carraway character, the man that Ginevra King ends up marrying, it becomes a trader and a stockbroker in the Midwest. And so does Nick Carraway. And I think that there's something in Fitzgerald that makes him realize that had he picked another path, he could have become the more decent human being. But instead, he excessively types up the letters of the woman that he loved and carries them around with him for the rest of his life. Not weird at all. But when you look at sort of these characters, I think one of the things that shifts, I think one of the reasons it isn't popular within the 1920s is we are in that heyday, right? It's really hard to look at something in the midst of it. It takes the crash, it takes the war. I think for people to be able to step back from the 1920s and see it with that sort of lens. And I wonder with writing something like this, how long before we finally see this shift where we stop glamorizing, celebrities and movie stars the way we have.
Yeah. Well, the way you ever. I don't know the answer to that question, and just the way that you framed that, it means a lot to me. It makes me think about processing my own book and the publishing process in a new way. Fitzgerald and I share the same publisher, Simon and Schuster, and Simon and Schuster was very deliberate in wanting to publish this book, 2025, 100 years after Gatsby was published. not with the idea that I'm the next great American writer by any means, but with the idea that Superior is asking really important questions of Fitzgerald while continuing to celebrate his place in the American canon. And, you know, the publishing industry it's really been hard, you know, the whole process has been a struggle. And just thinking about what the climate that we're in right now and how difficult the time is. And the fact that it's been interesting. I feel like other countries have generally responded more readily to this book than America. I'm not sure how eager America is to look at the critique that I'm getting. It gives me hope that, well, maybe when I'm dead, but certainly, maybe in the future, we have to go through, we're already, in my opinion, in a dark time, and maybe we have to go through a dark time to be able to have the strength and the ability to look.
Right, to reflect more openly and honestly about some of these things.
Yeah.
The publishing industry is really interesting, and just a deep background, I worked in publishing in a different century. And so it's been really interesting to watch the evolution of it. And, I can be fairly critical of it. I think that for the most part, publishing in American book publishing particularly has been driven by cowardice. They like publishing things that look like the other things that sold well. And I understand the need to make money, but I also see a sort of slide away from the intellectual challenge in a story. So walk us through a little bit, how did you get a publishing contract? What was that process? And, we talked about the fact that you have like the queen of agents that sort of spearheads your team, which is amazing that you were able to do that, and I think a compliment to your writing.
Thank you. So just a little bit of background on me. I grew up as a professional actor and then went to school for creative writing, but I was very hell-bent on being an actor. And then after graduating from Princeton, I was a theater director for 11 years in New York. And I was working on Ragdale and off, directing stuff off Broadway, and then moved my way up the Broadway ladder as an assistant and then as an associate director. And I'd written my first very bad novel for my senior thesis under Joyce, which nobody, not even my husband, is allowed to read. And then over the course of those 11 years, I wrote a second novel that was better. It wasn't good enough, but I did make some important contacts in the industry who said, basically the equivalent of a gold star. It was like, show us what you're writing next, you're good. And so I was basically, from 2018 to 2020, I was the associate director of residencies, which meant that I was running the show on Broadway and I was running the national tour. And I was literally in the rehearsal room putting in an actor with Broadway show that night, and we got the call the industry is shutting down. And so from that, after moping about and realizing, well, this pandemic thing doesn't seem to be going anywhere, I needed to, find a way to turn it into an opportunity for myself so I could stop sulking. And so I pitched an agent that I had been lately working with, a different agent, the woman that's not my agent today. I pitched her 5 ideas for 5 different books, and the last one that I pitched her, she said, that's the book I never written before, that's the book that you have to write. So I give all credit to her to sort of pointing me in the direction of writing this book. I wrote the first draft really quickly. As I mentioned, that Fitzgerald came into the picture, and a year after beginning writing this, so sort of summer 2021, I did what everybody kind of has to do. This is one of the nice things about the publishing industry is that it is kind of egalitarian, and that everybody pretty much has to go through the process of submitting blind to an agent, because you need an agent if you want to get a contract at a big publishing house. And so I decided to reach for the stars. I, sent out, you write a cover letter sort of query within 10 pages of the book. And I sent it to, my top 10 dream agents. One of them is this woman that Carol's referring to, Suzanne Gluck, who is, she runs William Morris, she's Oprah's agent, she's incredible.
She's God.
Yeah. I am not worthy. And so Suzanne, I sent this to her thinking, well, she's, whatever pipe dream. And she responded the same day and said, send me the draft. And so I sent her the draft. And then in the meantime, another agent had already gotten back to me saying, I want to work with you. And so I timidly emailed Suzanne and said, and to which she responded, I'm halfway through reading the weekend. And then on Monday, she called me and she asked if she wanted to work with me, which was just a dream come true. And honestly, you know, whatever success this book has, it's all due to my partnership with her. I mean, she was a game changer for me. Interestingly, so she basically came to me, and I ended up having two agents. It was Suzanne, and then it was a younger agent, more my generation, which was perfect because Suzanne, you know, is the god of the industry, and then I had somebody who could sort of handhold me through the weeds. And she basically then said, no, this is gonna be a big book, it's gonna be the next Gone Girl, it's got a lot of work, to do, because the way the publishing industry works these days, particularly for debut authors, is agents have to be editors. When you submit a book to try to get a publishing deal, that book better be as perfect done, exactly, like no edits necessary. And of course edits do get made, but it really needs to be tight. And so I worked with my two agents editing for 6 months, thinking, okay, early 2022, we're gonna be ready to go out. And then they call me up and they say, okay, it's a good shit, a few more little tweaks here. Here's the thing. And they then lay it on me that they have a conflict of interest, which is that they also represent the Fitzgerald estate. And they were concerned that my book would be seen as an adaptation of Tender as the Night. And Tender as the Night is not yet in public domain. And Fitzgerald estate, Fitzgerald is a controversial character, and they are very protective of his work. And my book, I as I mentioned, I love a lot of things about Fitzgerald, but this is not just pure adulation of Fitzgerald. I am critiquing Fitzgerald as well with this book. So they were very nervous about that. And so I ended up having to seek my own legal counsel, press pause, work with lawyers for 8 months, rewriting the book to make sure that no argument could be made that this is an adaptation of Tender as the Night, which, by the way, was never my intention, but just clarifying that to protect myself. And so it was a whole another year until the beginning of 23, and we were finally ready to go out. And at that point, they didn't tell me this, but secretly behind the scenes, Suzanne went to Olive William Morris and she said, okay, this is our big book. This is the book that I want the whole agency to be behind. And she also didn't tell me that they slipped it to these international scouts. And so I thought that we were just going out of the US. And I'm, sitting on my hands, trying to be patient, and 2 or so weeks go by and trying to tell myself that it takes people time to read a book. And suddenly in one day I go from having 2 agents to 6, and I get a call out of the blue from my international agent who has Germany on the line. And Fisher, which is one of the most prestigious publishing houses in Germany, has decided to make this unprecedented preempt on Sweet Fury. They only make offers on 2 American novels per year. And they wrote me the most amazing love letter that I've ever received in my life. And because they're so well esteemed, it was like every day a new country was making me an offer. And then eventually the US came in with
Howard's told you.
with an auction among 5 different publishing houses. And then with Simon & Schuster. So and then sort of the film industry followed. So it was an absolute whirlwind and a dream, and none of it would have happened without Suzanne.
Again,
Yeah.
amazing, and
Yeah.
credit to you. So it's a 2-book contract, correct? What's book number 2?
Oh my gosh, well, so it's great that you're asking me this after what you just said. Publishing, because I am really in the weeds about this, because so I've already written a draft of the next book. And I will tell you that pitch first. So I love this book. This book is much more ambitious than Sweet Fury. It is much more literary than Sweet Fury. It takes place over the course of multiple generations from about now going forward in time. It takes place on an island off the coast of America and is looking at the island as a microcosm of our country and how our country is failing to deal with the climate crisis. And it's also a modern feminist adaptation of a Greek tragedy. It is really ambitious. It's a mess, but I'm totally obsessed and in love with it. But my team, who nobody has read any pages of this book yet, but after having gone through the process of publishing Sweet Fury, they have said to me, you can publish that book later, but you need to set that book aside and you need to write something much more commercial for your next book. So now I am totally in the weeds and like ideating and figuring out what I'm gonna write next, and I don't have the answer to that yet, but that is exactly what you're talking about in the industry.
Build your name and then you can publish when you write it down. And what's your timeline on that? How long do you have?
It's open. I mean, I have to pop out a baby in August, so.
There's a secondary hobby.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Because, I mean, this is one of the things with Fitzgerald that was so fascinating. You know, he had Max Perkins, who was the god editor of his era. And he really, like, anybody who works in publishing or ever worked in publishing, Max Perkins is like this incredible idealized giant. And Fitzgerald never hit a single deadline, and he took years to write things, and he foundered tremendously. And with every published book, it took him longer and longer and longer. The gap between Gatsby and his last book, Tender as the Night, is like 9 years.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then he was so, torn up about it and this terrible reception that he actually went back and began editing his published book all over again. And there's a second version of Tender as the Night that was published posthumously because he was so destroyed by the fact that nobody wanted to read it, that he basically took everything that was out of order in the book, told non-chronologically and made it chronological. And in doing so, I believe kind of destroyed some of the nuance of the book. And the first book that was published is the one that is most widely read.
All right, so I don't want to take up all the time. Let's open it up to the audience for questions. Any questions? Were you all going to be shy? I love that.
Question about the title. I will try this. You did mention it in the book.
Mhm.
And I turned the page down. Yeah, find it. But what this was Sweet Fury, that was the revenge. Is that what Sweet Fury was her I'm gonna get him back.
I'm not gonna answer that because of spoilers, but what I will tell you about the title is that it was not the title for a long time. The book was actually for a long time until the publishing deal called Sweet Warm Dark. And the reasons for that there are a few. The book is, as I mentioned, divided into 3 sections. Each section was called Sweet, Warm, Dark, and they were meant to be sort of 3 sides of Lila, the main character. It is also taken from a Fitzgerald quote that occurs towards the end of Act 2 of my book. That is from a very obscure Fitzgerald short story, where at the end of the story, it's this romance, typical Fitzgerald romance. And after, will they or won't they end up together? They end up on a train, and the line, I'm gonna butcher it, but it's something like, and they looked at each other with infinite hope as they crossed over into the new sweet warm darkness. And I love that line because Fitzgerald meant it in this really idealistic, romantic way. But I was like, that is kind of creepy, And I love the dichotomy of that, and there's so much of that dichotomy in my book, so I wanted to capture that, the issue with that title. So Suzanne, my agent, when I first signed with her, the first thing she said was, great title. I thought, oh, thank God, at least I got the title. And then when I got my publishing deal with Simon & Schuster, my first email from my incredible editor was, setting up a Zoom, congratulations, let's meet, let's talk about the process, and also talk about the title. And basically the issue is that internally at Simon & Schuster, they were realizing that people in trying to talk about my book were mixing up the order of the three words, which is a huge red flag. And it was a big learning curve for me. I had thought that, you know, in looking at book titles, that it's really about getting at the core, the heart of what a book is about. And in fact, no, that is not what titles are all about marketing. It was all about like, what is gonna pop out to you, whether you're looking at it online or on the bookshelf, and what is something that is all gonna be on the tip of your tongue, that you are not gonna forget, you're not gonna bungle it, and sort of snappy and original. And so Sweet Fury was, it was months, it was torturous of me coming up with literally hundreds of title options for this book. We got really close to some that I'm so glad we didn't do, like, for example, Take Me, which was really close and really sounds like a bodice ripper. But, you know, Sweet Fury was literally, I was playing words to by a Google spreadsheet, and it was in a laundry list, I'm embarrassed to say, and they were like, actually, Sash, Sweet Fury is pretty good. And then, of course, with some distance and perspective, I've come to really love it too, because as I mentioned, it's, you know, it's these two things that you wouldn't think of together, but it sort of captures this essential dichotomy that is something that I'm examining and playing with in the book.
Yeah, and it feels good, as you go along. Can you talk about the process?
Sorry, we're gonna do this thing, and then I'll go to you right after.
You mentioned that there will be a movie of the book.
Well, fingers crossed. We had a deal with a production company of a very famous actress that we recently parted ways very amicably. So now it's being shot again. You know, everybody wants it to be made into a film or a limited series. We shall see. It's so hard to get things made.
So my question is, when you think about that, do you want to reserve to yourself the right to write the screenplay? Or are you open to someone else writing the screenplay of your book?
That's a great question. So when all of this was going down, when I was getting these amazing deals, I was out in LA and I met with all of a sudden I had 2 film and TV agents, and they sat me down and they said, okay, what do you want your career to look like? And I said, well, the most important thing to me is that this is made in the best way possible, and I don't want to do anything to stand in the way of that. That said, you know, my dream long term for myself would be to eventually be able to adapt my work and to eventually be able to direct my work. Which would feel really full circle for me. It would be bringing in all, you know, the other thing that I did is I narrated the vaudeville book, which brought back my acting, you know, so it's sort of all of these aspects of my life braiding together, and that's sort of the long view. But they, to their credit, they didn't bat an eye, and they said, oh, great, so for this one, we're gonna make you an executive producer, we're gonna make sure that you're on set the entire time in the room, so you're learning. And then, you know, you're gonna do some homework and teach yourself how to construct a good screenplay. And then for your next book, it will be a condition that you are gonna be writing an adaptation, and then it's a matter of time before you can direct it too. So, I mean, fingers crossed, I feel like that is a long way down the road for me. And like I said, most important thing to me is that the best version of these things get made. But that's the dream.
But do you think there's a different technique that you have to train yourself?
Oh, yeah.
Replay
Yeah.
versus the novel?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like you lose perspective when you're so close to your own work. And so there is definitely an advantage to bringing somebody else in. It can also really go the wrong way, as we all know from watching adaptations of some of our favorite works and how badly it can go. So I want to make sure I really know what I'm doing before I attempt to write something myself.
Can you talk about the process whereby you got rid of tender is the night in your novels so that it has legal muster?
Interestingly, so, you know, when I worked with this team of lawyers who this was their focus and their expertise, they were understandably very conservative, as lawyers should be. And they started really ripping apart the book and saying, well, you know, you really shouldn't have, you know, a main character be a therapist and a main character be an actress. And I was like, oh my God, like I can't. These things are, I didn't even know when I wrote this conceit of this plot. I didn't even know it existed. You know, I never read that book. Like, this is not my intention at all. I cannot rip it apart at that level. That would destroy the story that I'm trying to tell. And so I was very overwhelmed. It was a pretty dark time for me. I had, you know, panic attacks. And I took some time and I came back to it and I said, okay, let me pitch you this. What if instead of taking all of this apart, the solution is additive? What if there's already, you know, Gatsby references and other Fitzgerald references in there, but what if I lean harder into that? What if I really make this clear that this is, yes, Tender as the Night is something that I'm in conversation with, but it's clearly not just in conversation with Tender, it's in conversation with all of his works, and Tender is just merely one of his works. And so that was sort of the basic argument that they got on board with. And so then it was a matter of honing from there. The other really interesting part that I had to grapple with were there are a couple of chapters in the book that are on sets that are, you know, filming Tender of the Night, and so I'm directly using dialogue from the novel. And the big thing that the lawyers were focused on was making sure that I wasn't simply just sort of retelling or showing once again the story of Tender, but that I was adding commentary, new commentary to Tender. And so that became something that was really like line by line specific work with the lawyers to make sure that like the direction of those scenes was new added commentary to Tender. Yeah. But it got to a point where I sort of cut the cord at a certain point because they, you know, were pushing it so far that I do believe that word actually made the book much better. Like I'm actually, you know, it was a horrible time. I am grateful that it, you know, got the book to the place that it is, but there was a point where I said, okay, if I do any more of this tweaking that you're asking me to do, the book is gonna get worse. You know, so I actually had to cut it off and say, there's a little bit of risk here, I'm sadly willing to take that risk. And my hope, and so far, knock on wood, my hope is that this book makes people want to read Fitzgerald, that like makes them more interested in Tender as the Night, and so that the Fitzgerald estate would see that.
I found your first few comments fascinating about how 100 years later we still have this fixation on fame and money. And at a cocktail party, generously, the Great Gatsby cocktail party, generally supported by Scott and Susan Garrett. I was talking with Ian Connell, some of you may know him. He was doing some research on his home and interviewing different people here in Lake Forest. And he made the comment that prior to about the 1920s, the currency, the social currency of Lake Forest was actually respectability. And that after the 1920s, when money came, and I would say a more mass media, so to speak, with radio, et cetera, coming into more people's homes, it changed. And so I'm wondering, is that a theme that people have explored? Like, how do you define respectability in an era where people don't really know each other?
Oh, I don't know the answer to that, but that is such a good question. I think just something that brought to mind for me is, you know, as you may know, Fitzgerald was responsible for coining the term the jazz age. Like that is all due to him, and it's a bit of a chicken and egg question as to, you know, his depiction of this sort of very gluttonous, hedonistic life of, you know, sex and drinking and partying and dancing and sort of living wild and sort of being young and free. You know, is this something that he was just sort of saying, this is the truth of my generation, I'm going to put pen to paper? Or was he also sort of encouraging it? Was it sort of, you know, a cycle that built upon itself?